She was running on 3 hours of sleep, a stained blouse, and the desperate hope that her blind date would at least pay for his own coffee. He was a billionaire pretending to be a mid-level accountant just to get a quiet evening. Neither expected the collision that followed. The rain was relentless, cold, spiteful, and perfectly timed to ruin Maeve's only good pair of suede boots. She stood under the frayed awning of a corner diner, clutching a broken umbrella, mentally calculating if she could afford an Uber home. She couldn't. Rent was due in 4 days. Her 7-year-old son, Finn, needed a new winter coat. The math was always there, an endless, exhausting ticker tape running behind her eyes. She pushed the heavy glass door open. The diner smelled of old grease, wet wool, and burnt coffee. It wasn't exactly the backdrop for romance, but romance wasn't what Maeve was looking for. She was here because her sister Clara had worn her down through a campaign of sheer psychological warfare. Just one drink, Maeve. He's an accountant. He's boring. You need boring. You need a man who doesn't own a motorcycle or a criminal record. Boring sounded like a vacation. She spotted him in a vinyl booth near the back. He wasn't looking at his phone. That was the first surprise. In a city where everyone was permanently tethered to a screen, he was simply sitting there, staring out the rain-streaked window, nursing a mug of black coffee. He wore a navy crew neck sweater that had seen better days, and a shadow of stubble that suggested a long, unforgiving shift. Maeve walked over, her damp boots squeaking against the linoleum. She slid into the booth opposite him. "You must be Dominic." He turned. His eyes were dark, tired, but remarkably sharp. He didn't offer a practiced plastic smile. "And you're Maeve, Clara's sister." "The very same." She shrugged out of her damp coat, letting it pool on the cracked vinyl beside her. "I'm going to be honest with you, Dominic. I have a kid who thinks sleep is a mild suggestion, a boss who thinks labor laws are a myth. And I'm only sitting here right now because my sister promised to babysit for free." Dominic stared at her for a long second. He didn't blink. Then, the corner of his mouth twitched upward. The heavy exhaustion in his shoulders seemed to drop a fraction of an inch. "I appreciate the efficiency. I'm here because my brother thinks I work too much and threatened to change the locks on my apartment if I didn't interact with someone outside of my office." "Accountant, right?" she asked, flagging down a waitress who looked just as tired as they did. "Finance," he corrected smoothly. His voice was low, gravelly. "Numbers, spreadsheets. A lot of staring at screens until my eyes blur and the columns start bleeding together." "Sounds riveting." "It's mostly soul-crushing," he said, and he sounded like he meant it down to his bones. "What about you?" "Supply chain logistics," Maeve said. "I track boxes of things people don't actually need, making sure they get from a warehouse in Ohio to a doorstep in Seattle on time. It pays the bills, mostly." They ordered a grilled cheese and fries for her, a plain burger for him. No pretentious wine. No awkward debate over appetizers. Just tap water and cheap diner food. The conversation didn't sparkle. It didn't crackle with cinematic chemistry. It was grounded, heavy, real. Maeve found herself talking about the absurdity of middle school math homework and the aggressively rising cost of eggs. She talked about a dull, persistent ache in her lower back from sitting in a cheap office chair. Dominic listened. He didn't offer unsolicited advice. He didn't try to mansplain inflation or offer a hollow platitude about how things would get better. He just nodded, asking sharp, specific questions that showed he was actually paying attention. You don't talk much about yourself, Maeve pointed out, tearing a crust off her sandwich. Dominic looked down at his hands. They were clean, but there was a faint callus on the base of his thumb. Not much to say. I manage portfolios. I try to keep people from making stupid emotional mistakes with their money. It's mostly just babysitting adults who have more ego than sense. I'd rather babysit a 7-year-old, Maeve said, leaning back. At least when Finn throws a tantrum because he can't have ice cream for breakfast, I can just take away his television privileges. Dominic let out a sudden, genuine laugh. It was a good sound, deep, resonant, and entirely unpracticed. I wish I could take away my clients' privileges. It would solve about 80% of my daily headaches. Unfortunately, when adults throw tantrums, it usually involves a lot of paperwork. They sat there for 2 hours. The rain eventually stopped, leaving the city slick and reflective. The diner emptied out, leaving only the hum of the neon sign in the window. For the first time in 3 years, Maeve wasn't thinking about her bank balance. She wasn't thinking about her ex-husband's sporadically missed child support payments. She was just sitting across from a man who seemed just as bruised by the grind of daily survival as she was. When the faded green check came, Dominic instinctively reached for it, but Maeve put a hand over his. His skin was warm. "We split it," she said firmly. "I don't owe you. You don't owe me." Dominic looked at her hand resting on his, then up at her face. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. He didn't argue. He pulled a battered leather wallet from his back pocket and laid down a $20 bill. "It was a nice night, Maeve," he said a few minutes later, as they stood on the damp pavement outside. The cold air bit at Maeve's cheeks. "It wasn't terrible," she conceded, wrapping her scarf tighter. He smiled again. It reached his eyes this time. "High praise. Can I call you?" She hesitated. Hope was a dangerous thing to afford. It was a luxury she usually couldn't budget for. But looking at the quiet, steady man in front of her, she relented. "Sure, Dominic, you can call me." The brutal reality of Monday morning hit Maeve like a physical blow. The fluorescent lights of Apex Logistics buzzed with a sound that drilled directly into her temples. The air in the bullpen was thick with nervous sweat, stale coffee, and the distinct, sour scent of corporate panic. Apex hadn't just been bought out. They had been swallowed whole. Hayes Global, a massive conglomerate known for gutting mid-level operations and selling off the scraps, had finalized the acquisition over the weekend. Rumors of mass layoffs had been tearing through the cubicles since 8 a.m. Greg, the VP of Operations, was currently pacing in front of the glass conference room, his dress shirt entirely sweat through at the armpits. "They're doing a floor walkthrough," Greg barked, his voice cracking. "The new CEO is here. Do not look at him. Do not speak unless spoken to. If your desk is a mess, clear it. Now." Maeve rolled her eyes, minimizing a spreadsheet. "Greg, he's a CEO, not a monarch. He's not going to execute us." "You don't understand, Maeve. Dominic Hayes is ruthless. He fired an entire executive board in Chicago last month before he even took his coat off. Just keep your head down." Maeve sighed, returning to her routing software. She had 2 missing freight trucks in Nevada and a client screaming on line 3. A billionaire strolling through the office to stroke his own ego was the least of her problems. She pushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear and focused on her monitor. The elevator doors chimed at the end of the hall. The noise on the floor died instantly. It wasn't a gradual quiet. It was a sudden, suffocating silence, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Maeve heard the synchronized click of expensive leather shoes on the hardwood. She kept her eyes on her screen. A small entourage of dark suits moved past her row. She could hear the murmur of Greg's sycophantic voice, trembling as he pointed out the various departments. "And here's our regional routing division," Greg stuttered. "We've increased efficiency by 4% this quarter." "Your routing software is outdated by 3 years, Greg," a voice interrupted. "A 4% increase on a broken system isn't a victory. It's life support." Maeve froze. Her fingers stopped moving over the keyboard. Her breath hitched. She knew that voice. Low, gravelly, carrying a quiet authority that didn't need to yell to be heard. It was the voice of a man who complained about his eyes blurring over spreadsheets. A man who ate a cheap diner burger and laughed about babysitting adults. Slowly, against every instinct of self-preservation, Maeve turned her head. He was standing 10 feet away. The faded navy sweater was gone. In his place was a bespoke, charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Maeve's annual salary. A silver Patek Philippe watch caught the harsh office light on his wrist. His posture was entirely different. There was no heavy slump of exhaustion. He stood straight, radiating a cold, impenetrable power. He looked like a predator, surveying a very small, very trapped herd. Dominic Hayes. Maeve felt the blood drain from her face. Her stomach dropped into a sickening freefall. He wasn't a mid-level accountant. He wasn't tired of the corporate grind. He was the grind. He owned it. As if sensing her stare, Dominic turned his head. His dark eyes swept over the cubicles and landed directly on her. For a split second, the mask slipped. The cold, ruthless CEO vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine, unadulterated shock. He stopped walking. The entire entourage behind him slammed to a halt, a domino effect of confused executives. Dominic stared at her. Maeve stared back. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She felt a hot, sharp spike of betrayal pierce through her chest. It wasn't cute. It wasn't a funny misunderstanding. He had sat across from her, listened to her complain about the price of groceries, and let her split a $20 diner bill while he casually owned half the supply chain she slaved over. He had played her. He had put on a costume and played the poor, tired working man for an evening of entertainment. Dominic took a half step toward her, his mouth parting slightly. "Maeve?" Greg looked like he was about to faint. "You know Ms. Collins, Mr. Hayes?" Dominic didn't look at Greg. His eyes were locked on Maeve, reading the furious, icy realization settling over her features. "We've met." "How nice," Maeve said. Her voice was steady, but it dripped with a terrifying, cynical calm. She stood up from her cheap mesh chair. "Mr. Hayes and I bumped into each other recently. He was telling me all about how soul-crushing it is to manage portfolios. It must be exhausting, deciding which of our jobs to liquidate today." The silence in the room became lethal. The executives behind Dominic stared at her as if she had just pulled a pin from a grenade. Dominic's jaw tightened. The shock in his eyes hardened into something defensive, yet desperate. "Maeve, step into Greg's office. Now." "I don't think that's necessary," she replied, grabbing her coffee mug. "I have 2 missing trucks in Nevada to locate. Unless you want to fire me right now and save us both the paperwork." Office. Now. It wasn't a request. It was an order from a man who had never been told no. Maeve held his gaze for 3 agonizing seconds. She wasn't a helpless 20-something. She was a mother. She was a survivor. She didn't flinch. Slowly, she walked out from behind her desk and marched toward the glass-walled office, leaving a billionaire standing in the middle of the floor, looking entirely out of his depth. The door of the glass-walled office clicked shut, sealing off the frantic hum of the bullpen. Inside, the silence was absolute. The room smelled of industrial glass cleaner and the sharp, anxious tang of Greg's cologne. Maeve didn't sit down. She stood near the heavy oak desk, crossing her arms over her chest. It was a defensive posture, and she knew it. But right now, she needed the armor. Dominic stood near the door. The aggressive confidence he had carried on the floor seemed to have evaporated the moment the latch clicked. He ran a hand over his face, a gesture that reminded her painfully of the exhausted man from the diner. "I can explain," he said. His voice was low, devoid of the corporate bite he had used on Greg. "There is nothing to explain, Mr. Hayes," Maeve replied, keeping her tone flat. "You lied. You sat there for 2 hours and played a character. Was it research? A social experiment? Did you just want to see how the peasants complain about their rent? No, God, no." He took a step forward, then stopped when she didn't move to meet him. "My brother set up the dating profile. He used my middle name. He put down my old job title from 12 years ago because he said if I used my real name, I'd just attract women who wanted a black card, not a conversation. I didn't plan it. I showed up. And then you sat down. And you decided to keep up the charade. You were so honest," Dominic said, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Within 5 minutes, you laid out your entire reality. You were exhausted, you were stressed, and you looked at me like I was just a guy. You didn't look at my watch. You didn't care about my portfolio. You handed me half the bill for a $20 meal. I haven't had someone treat me like a normal human being in a decade, Maeve. I didn't want to break the spell." Maeve let out a short, hollow laugh. "The spell, right, because this is a fairy tale for you." She walked toward him, closing the distance until she was standing a few feet away. She didn't shrink back from his height or his expensive suit. "Let me explain reality to you, Dominic. You get to play dress-up. You get to put on a cheap sweater, eat a greasy burger, and pretend your biggest problem is a spreadsheet. But at the end of the night, you get in a black car and go back to a penthouse. I go back to a 2-bedroom apartment where the heat barely works. I have a 7-year-old son who outgrows his shoes every 6 months. My job, this job, the one you just bought and are probably going to gut, is the only thing keeping a roof over our heads." Dominic's jaw tightened. "I'm not going to gut your division. I wouldn't do that to you." "Do not insult me," Maeve snapped, her voice finally raising a fraction. The glass walls felt like they were closing in. "Don't you dare stand there and act like you're doing me a favor. If my division is failing, you cut it. If it's working, you keep it. But do not make my livelihood a consolation prize because you feel guilty about lying to me on a blind date." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she saw the realization hit him. He had thought the money, the power, the ability to save her job would soften the blow. He didn't understand that to her, it was just another reminder of the chasm between them. "I'm sorry," he said softly. It sounded ripped from his throat. "Keep your apology," Maeve said, turning her back on him and reaching for the door handle. "Just keep your suits and your executives away from my desk. I have missing freight trucks to find. I have a job to do." She walked out of the office, She didn't look back to see the billionaire standing alone in the quiet glass box. She went back to her cheap mesh chair, put her headset on, and spent the next 6 hours tracking 18-wheelers across the Nevada desert. Her hands shook for the first 2 hours, but she didn't stop typing. That evening, the exhaustion hit her the moment she unlocked her apartment door. The smell of old wood and the faint scent of Finn's damp sneakers in the hallway grounded her. Finn was sitting at the small kitchen table, aggressively attacking a math worksheet with a blunt pencil. "Mom!" he yelled, dropping the pencil. "Clara said we can have pizza tonight." Clara emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She took one look at Maeve's pale face and rigid shoulders. "Okay, buddy, go wash your hands. Extra soap. I need to talk to your mom." Once Finn was out of earshot, Clara leaned against the counter. "What happened? You look like you just got hit by a bus." "Worse," Maeve muttered, dropping her purse onto the cracked linoleum. "I got bought out by my blind date." Clara blinked. "What?" "Over cold pizza," Maeve told her. She told her about the suit, the entourage, the cold realization that the tired accountant she had actually liked was the ruthless CEO currently restructuring her entire company. Clara sat in stunned silence, her slice of pepperoni forgotten on a paper plate. "He's a billionaire," Clara finally whispered, as if the word itself was contraband. "Maeve, he owns Apex." "He owns a lot of things. He doesn't own me," Maeve said fiercely, taking a sip of tap water. She looked past Clara toward the small living room where Finn was now building a precarious tower out of wooden blocks. "I don't need a savior, Clara. I definitely don't need a liar. I just need a paycheck." "But he liked you," Clara pointed out gently. "He wanted to be normal for you." "Normal isn't a costume you take off when it gets uncomfortable," Maeve said, her voice heavy with fatigue. She rested her head in her hands, pressing her fingers against her temples. "He doesn't understand what it means to survive. He only knows how to win." She went to bed that night with the math still running in her head. Rent, groceries, the impending layoffs. The image of Dominic Hayes standing in her office, looking genuinely gutted, kept flashing behind her eyelids. She forced it away. She couldn't afford to care about a billionaire's broken heart. She had a son to feed. The following week was a corporate bloodbath. Hayes Global moved with a surgical, terrifying efficiency. 2 entire floors of Apex Logistics were cleared out by Wednesday. The severance packages were generous, surprisingly so, but the fear in the building was palpable. People packed their boxes in hushed, devastated silence. Maeve's division survived. Not a single person on her floor was let go. Greg paraded around as if his own leadership had saved them. But Maeve knew the truth. It sat like a lead weight in her stomach. She hated it. She hated knowing that her continued employment wasn't just about her metric outputs, but about a man in a penthouse trying to clear his conscience. She didn't see Dominic all week. He was a ghost in the building, an invisible force making sweeping decisions from the executive boardroom on the top floor. Maeve kept her head down, did her job, and left precisely at 5 p.m. every day. On Friday, the sky broke open. It was a torrential, angry downpour that flooded the gutters and turned the city into a gray, watery blur. Maeve stood at the glass doors of the lobby, pulling the collar of her thin trench coat up around her neck. She didn't have an umbrella. She had left her broken one in the diner a week ago. She took a deep breath, preparing to sprint the 4 blocks to the subway, when a dark sedan pulled up to the curb. It wasn't a stretch limousine. It was an unassuming black car. but the sleek, heavy lines betrayed its price tag. The back door opened, and a large black umbrella blossomed in the rain. Dominic stepped out. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing jeans, boots, and a heavy waterproof jacket. He walked up the steps toward the lobby doors. The few remaining employees in the lobby stopped and stared, whispering furiously. But Dominic didn't notice them. He was looking directly at Maeve. He stopped a few feet away, shaking the excess water from the umbrella. "You're going to catch pneumonia," he said, his voice cutting through the sound of the rain. "I'll take my chances," Maeve said coldly, stepping around him. He didn't grab her arm. He didn't block her path. He simply matched her pace, holding the large umbrella over her head as she marched out into the downpour. "Go away, Dominic," she said, water splashing against her shins as she hit a puddle. "I can't." He kept stride with her, ignoring the rain that was now soaking his own left shoulder. "I've spent the last 4 days sitting in a boardroom, liquidating redundant assets, and all I could think about was the fact that you think I'm a coward." "I don't think you're a coward," Maeve said, her breath pluming in the cold air. "I think you're a tourist. You visited my life, found it charming, and now you want to buy a souvenir. I'm not for sale." Dominic stopped walking. The sudden halt forced Maeve to stop too, unless she wanted to step out from under the heavy canvas shield of the umbrella. She turned to face him, the wet city lights reflecting in her furious eyes. "I didn't keep your division to buy you," Dominic said, his voice dropping into a harsh, raw register. "I had my analysts run the numbers blind. No names, no departments. Your routing software is outdated, yes, but your team's crisis management metrics were the highest in the entire company. You kept them. You earned it. I expedited the paperwork." Maeve stared at him. The relentless rain hammered against the umbrella between them, a deafening drumbeat. "I know I messed up," Dominic continued, his dark eyes searching her face. "I know I can't pretend the money isn't there. I know I have power that makes this uneven. But I also know that when I sat across from you in that diner, I felt like I could actually breathe. You didn't want anything from me, Maeve. You still don't. That terrifies me. But it's also the only real thing I've touched in years." He reached into his jacket pocket. Maeve tensed, expecting a jewelry box or the keys to a new car. Instead, he pulled out a small, brightly colored object. It was a brand-new heavy-duty umbrella. Compact, practical, and expensive in the way things are when they are built to last a lifetime, not a season. He held it out to her. "I noticed you left yours at the diner. The waitress was throwing it in the trash. I couldn't fix it, so I got you a new one. It's windproof." Maeve looked down at the umbrella. It was such a small, mundane thing. It wasn't a mortgage payoff. It wasn't a diamond. It was a tool to keep her dry on her walk to the subway. It was an acknowledgement of her daily grind, a quiet recognition of her reality. Slowly, she reached out and took it. Her fingers brushed against his, and just like in the diner, his skin was warm. "You can't just buy my company and then buy me an umbrella and expect everything to be fine," Maeve said, her voice finally losing its hard, cynical edge. It sounded tired. It sounded human. "I don't expect it to be fine," Dominic said, a small, genuine smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "I expect it to be difficult. I expect you to yell at me when I do something out of touch. I expect to earn it." He stepped back, entirely out from under the shelter of his own umbrella, letting the rain soak his hair and his jacket. He looked entirely ridiculous, standing on a flooded sidewalk in a puddle. He looked nothing like a billionaire CEO. "I have a kid, Dominic," she said softly. "I have a messy, loud, complicated life. There is no room in it for games." "No games," he promised, wiping rain from his eyes. "Just a guy, just a woman. And maybe, if you're willing to risk it, another terrible cup of diner coffee." Maeve looked at him standing in the freezing rain, just to prove a point. The cynical wall she had spent years building cracked, just a fraction, letting a sliver of terrifying, irrational hope slip through. She gripped the handle of her new umbrella. "The coffee there really is awful." "The worst," Dominic agreed, a real laugh escaping him. "Are you free on Tuesday?" Maeve let out a long breath, watching the city lights blur in the rain. "Tuesday works, but I'm picking the place this time, and you're paying." "Deal." They stood there for a moment longer, two people from entirely different worlds, anchored to the pavement by a shared, quiet understanding. The rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean, leaving behind nothing but the solid, unshakable ground. Did Dominic's grounded apology and the umbrella gesture win you over? Or do you think Maeve should have made him work harder for a second chance? Navigating power, wealth, and genuine connection is never easy. But this story proves that sometimes the smallest actions speak the loudest. If you felt every moment of this emotional roller coaster, hit that like button. Share this video with a friend who loves romance with real stakes. And subscribe for more deep, heartfelt stories.